Well, welcome everybody. Good morning. As you can
Yes.
see here, we're beaming in from the other side of the world. So it's dark here, but the night is yet young for Trevor and I. This is our third in the Bidding to Win webinar series. Are you taking the right amount of risk? If you haven't seen the other two webinars, you can still catch up on those, and it probably doesn't matter too much which order you watch them in. So do look at the others. So let's move on. Trevor and I, as I said, we're in the UK. This morning, our time, we did the same webinar to a bunch of people in the UK and North America. And now today we're beaming into Australia and Asia Pacific. So today's webinar will last about 30 minutes and there'll be a Q&A session at the end. So I do hope that you can stay for that. So what's the agenda? Well, bidding is a real challenge. Bidding to win is an even bigger challenge. I'm going to go through a few thoughts and give you some ideas around the challenge first. Then Trevor's going to come in and talk about how to do it in practice. And he's going to use our Predict software to have a look at some of the things that, in our experience, you could use at a high level. It's an overview for you to get some ideas on what you might be able to do. And then I'll come back, talk about the benefits, and we'll have our Q&A session. The challenge. Well, if you watched the last two webinars, you'll know that I talked about the KPMG 2021. It was at the end of last year. They brought out a report on project delivery confidence. And in there, they quote, along with a number of other reports, that there's currently expected to be a $3.2 trillion annual spend on infrastructure projects to 2030. So the whole building back better, building back greener around the world, there's huge money going into infrastructure. And if you put on top of that defence, and we all know the current situation of defence budgets going up around the world with the current crisis. And so we have huge money going into projects. So it's very concerning that 9 out of 10 mega projects come in over budget and often typically late. So as usual, we quite like to give some tangible examples. And in this case, the horror story, just about 4 or 5 years ago, Carillion, huge construction giant working out of the UK, collapsed. It was huge media news because they were working on many, many projects, lots of them government projects, spending our taxpayers' money. And this was one of the quotes in the news at the time: construction giants' collapse is a disaster, not just for employees and taxpayers, but for the public-private partnership policy. So Carillion, what went wrong? Well, unfortunately, they were in a bit of a race to the bottom. They got themselves into a bit of a mess. They were bidding projects at the lowest price they could, because they were desperate to win projects. They were trying to present to the world that they were still very much in business. And unfortunately, they were just having one disaster after another. The media quoted 4 projects at the end that they reckon completely finished them off. They were building 2 hospitals. And as you'll know, if you watched our previous webinars, Trevor talks about groundworks problems being a typical risk. And one of those, there was a major problem with a hospital they were building in Liverpool on a brownfield site, and there were serious cracks that they had to deal with. They also had asbestos problems, wiring and pipe working taking too long. Then there was a Scottish road. Well, surprise, surprise, cold weather during the winter caused them serious delays. And then there was also a big project in the Middle East where cash flow problems, they weren't being paid on time, lots of issues going on. And so cash flow wise, they were in a very, very bad position. And there've been many construction companies around the world that have hit these kind of problems. So even though there's massive amounts of money, bidding is an absolutely fundamental thing that you've got to get right in order to be in business. There is another project that we'd like to highlight today, and that is a project that we've been working on for about the last 10 years, a Danish project to build a fixed link between Germany and Denmark. At the very initial stages, they had to make big decisions on whether it would be a tunnel or a bridge. We were delighted to be involved in some of and understand some of those things at an early stage. And surprise, surprise, they actually chose a tunnel rather than what we thought the politician's choice would be a nice looking bridge to have a nice photo opportunity in front of. But there were lots of different choices to make, including how to deal with the environmental issues, things like modelling traffic emissions over a period of 3 decades, really interesting things. So bids are very complex things. Getting it right is fundamental. Okay, so how do we actually establish a price and a promise date? So our previous 2 webinars, we talked about getting the understanding what's in the baseline and the uncertainty around the baseline. Then on top of that, we added a risk modelling exercise in order to work out what your contingency budget would be, choosing a confidence level. And in many, one of the things that I'm working on at the moment is helping as subject matter expert on an ISO guide, how management reserve is calculated. And one of the key things that has come out of that work is that it's so important that you include your risk treatment actions in the baseline. Because if you don't, then whatever your contingency budget is over optimistic, you're never going to make it. We also, in one of the other webinars, talked about producing a value for schedule reserve, and that sits on the right. So making sure that your promise date has got some contingency schedule reserve in it in order to make sure you absolutely can nail delivering on time. And the case study there we presented was the 2012 Athletes Village. You can't be late for the Olympics. And lastly, once you've identified all of that, then you need to decide what's your margin, you need to make a profit, and that makes up your price. So we're going to look a bit more in detail when Trevor looks at our Predict software at producing this final value. Now, all of this is fundamental that you make the right decisions along the way during your bid. And we know that bids are very, very tight. You never have enough resources. You've never got enough time. And that's why you can see building up this picture, which includes risk, it's very important that you start early enough and you have the right people ready to make those decisions. So let's have a quick look at decision making. A really interesting study done by McKinsey a little while ago. They looked at the importance of decision making, and you can see the quote on the right here. Their conclusion was that organizations that make decisions quickly are twice as likely to make high quality decisions compared with slow decision makers. Now, it's pretty difficult to make good decisions unless you've got the data to make those decisions on. And our view is that those decisions need to be risk-based decisions, because if you don't handle the risk, it's going to eat into your margin. You're going to make a loss. You're going to have unhappy customers. So looking at this in a little bit more detail, you'll see the graph here, the chart. There are 4 elements to it, and the left-hand 3 are what McKinsey call the foundational practices, the 3 foundational practices. The first one on the left is making decisions at the right level, and that might mean having the right level of delegated authority to make decisions. The second one is aligning your decisions with strategy. And in the case of risk, that means understanding your trade-offs and your objectives and ensuring that your risk appetite or risk tolerance is at the right, that you understand what that is. And the third foundational practice is committing to those decisions. Now, one of the things that you need to do in a bid is to ensure that any risk that you decide to take, you understand exactly how you're going to manage that risk, and you need to make sure your mitigation actions, or if you're taking opportunities, any actions that you want to exploit, you've catered for those in the baseline. Otherwise, you're just being over-optimistic and you'll never make it. Now, the results of this survey, you can see on the left-hand side, it shows that organizations that used the first foundation practice of making decisions at the right level, they were 27% likely to be successful as opposed to 4% of organisations that didn't exercise that practice. And across the 3 pillars, then they added it up at the far right, the right-hand one in the 4th pillar, and you can see there that organisations that exercised all 3 foundational principles were 38 times more likely to be successful than those that didn't. So that's pretty amazing. That was a survey over about 100 organisations, I believe, that they did that. Okay, so let's move on to having a look at how we actually do this. And here we've got predict. Trevor is going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the risks in the risk register. That's the risk controller system, how to use the analysis in order to generate some interesting views of cost benefit, scenario analysis, and also looking at key risk and how you might work out how to negotiate that one with the customer. So over to you, Trevor.
Thanks, Val. So what we're looking at here is the risk register that we've developed for Project A, which is the bid we're putting together. So these are all of the different risks. So I've got a groundworks problem risk here, then a planning approval delayed, and then various others. I'm also showing the actions that we've so far decided that we're going to take. So I've got an additional survey as an action against the groundworks problem. And what the system is showing me is that currently I'm looking at a score of a high score of 12 for this groundworks problem. And I've set myself a target, my risk tolerance of a medium for this one. And as you can see at the bottom down here, that performing this action, we expect that action to get us down to that medium. I'm also taking into account, so we need to make sure that that action goes into our baseline, as Val said. But also, I've also got to put that budget in there. And I'm saying this action is likely to cost me around 25,000.
So Trevor, that action, you'd put that money into the baseline, would you?
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. And also, you said we're leaving that risk, the target is medium. I guess that's something we'd have to take back to the project board and make sure that they're happy with that as a risk tolerance.
That's right. Yeah.
We really do need to make sure we're going into this project with our eyes open.
That's it, and that's what I'll be doing. I'll be basing the post mitigated analysis on these target scores here.
Okay, so I can see the next one, but that says there's a target of low, but I can't see actions that have got it to that low value.
Yeah, well spotted. Yeah, that's a little bit of an issue that we've got at the moment that we do need to do. But it's useful to have this visualization of that because we're saying or we're assessing how we think each action is going to help us reduce the impact or the probability of the risk. You can see how the score should look after completing these actions. And as you quite rightly said, I'm sitting down here at a score of 6, even though my target, my risk tolerance is only a 4. So again, when we need to do some more work on that, it's either going to come up with other actions or we might have to take a different strategy. And we'll look at that. We'll look at that in a minute, I think. Yeah?
So there's two. Are those two actions? There's no score against those. So what's that then?
Okay, yeah, right. So I've got a couple of different things here. The first two that have got the score, and in fact their individual costs associated with them, because those are costs that we need to put into our project baseline. These are specific mitigation actions that we want to perform. Whereas I've just linked here a couple of controls. So these are sort of business as usual controls that are going on. So I don't have an extra project budget to have to know that those are happening, but I am linking them so that I can see that I've taken those into account when assessing both the pre and the post mitigation situations for the risk.
Okay, so we're getting close to our bid deadline. So where are we in terms of the budget then?
Yeah, well, what we need to do is run our analysis, and that brings up my view here. I'll just quickly explain what we've got on the screen here. At the moment, we're looking at the current assessment, and it's giving me on this side the distribution of the potential total cost impact of all of those risks. And my little sliders up here enable me to see that 90% of the time, those risks will cost less than 2.8 million. On the right-hand side here is what we call the tornado chart. And in a lot of cases, all you get here is a sensitivity percentage, just sort of telling you which of the risks are driving your total cost the most. But we're giving you some really useful information to share with management now. This particular risk here, the groundworks problem one that's highlighted, if we didn't have that risk in there at all, our 90% confidence would be reduced by 850,000. So really can straight away see the benefit of moving that. Now, that's just a quick view of the screen, because what I really wanted to look at is the target view here. So this is looking at the green distribution is all of the risks running the same analysis, but based upon that target assessment for each of those risks. Okay.
So if we achieve the post-mitigated value we're trying to get to, where we're aiming for, then that shows that we can save a whole load of money. That's okay.
Yeah. So in total, my 90% confidence is 2.5 million less than our current assessment. Okay. Now, again, I've got my individual risks over here, and I've highlighted this groundworks problem one, and that's telling me that if we can mitigate this risk, I would be actually, just over 1 million better off. But not only are we telling you that, we're giving you a cost benefit ratio here. Right, so you can see it's just over 16 to 1. So the target cost subtracted from the current cost, but divided by the cost of those actions. Remember, those actions need to be in our baseline, is a ratio of over 16 to 1. So it's a no-brainer.
So that's telling us, I mean, that's kind of saying if I put $1 in, I get $16 back. That sounds quite good.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. If only could find an investment like that.
Right. Yeah, better than putting it in the bank. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but you, as you say, you actually have to make sure you do your mitigation actions. Okay.
Very much so. Right.
But that's the groundworks problem. Were you going to go on to look at the other one?
Yeah, that other one we were looking at on our risk register was that the planning approval delayed. Okay. And I think what we need to do here is to try and see a different approach, because if you remember, we didn't have the actions in place that would get us to our target score. So what I wanted to try and do was to look, instead of at the 90%, all the way up at the 100%. This is something you do really need to be careful of, is this tail. 90%, there you go, it's 2.8, 2.9 million, but the extra 10% could take us all the way up to 5.2 million. That's quite a big increase if you think about it.
And if that were to happen, then that would really diminish our margin, our profit, wouldn't it? So we are
diminish.
I think it's one of the things that you really need to see this picture, because saying 90% sounds, well, to most people that'd be like, well, that's pretty good. Yeah, I'd take a bet on that. But look how much you could overrun and go over budget. That's pretty scary. Okay.
It is. That's right. So one of the options we've perhaps got with this particular planning approval delayed risk is to see if we can negotiate it out of the contract. But to help us do that, I want to try and sort of see a before and after. So I'm going to create a scenario and say, okay, let's have, so planning removed, and let's take that one out and run that. One thing I ought to do here, though, is to actually increase the number of slices, because now we're at the right at the extremes, the 100%. Then we're quite likely to have a few outliers. So I just wanted to remove those potentially. Takes a little bit longer now.
Trevor, what you're saying is if you're working at, say, the 50% confidence level or even the 90, then the results are going to be fairly static or reasonable. But if you go to the 100%, then you've got to have enough slices run.
That's right, so that we don't get an odd occurrence. That's right. So, and now I'm just comparing that with the base, i.e. everything in there, and see that the two graphs now. So the green is all of the risks, the blue is having taken away the planning approval delayed. And at 90%, it's saving us about $500,000. But the interesting thing is this tail bit. Look at this.
Okay, all right. So that is where the risk really lies. If we, we can go for the 90%, but we've still got that big risk somewhere in there that we are having to deal with. Okay.
That's right. And we can see here, and we can explain to the client that if we can remove, if they take that risk on, say, and it is a planning one, so perhaps it is more appropriate for them to be able to deal with it, then we can, we're not exposed to this potential 2 million cost. Therefore, our bid will be able to come in at a much lower price.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is very similar to one of the projects bids that I worked on some time ago, and we've got a white paper on it, the successful planners white paper,
yes,
where we successfully negotiated out a risk with the customer because we demonstrated that to take that risk we'd want a lot of money for it, and for them to take it was much more sensible. Yeah. Okay,
great,
interesting.
Okay. So remember that. So let's actually go back to that risk. So we've worked out what our strategy needs to be by using the analysis here, and the strategy is to remove, to basically hand that risk over to the customer. So once this has just finished completing itself.
Okay, so that risk it's showing removing it removes nearly $1.5 million. Okay,
that's
wow.
it.
All right.
So what I wanted to do is to go straight back into controller, okay? Because we weren't changing anything. Remember that? The whole point we were trying was try things out, right? So I wasn't changing the database. So if we come back in here, then we can again remind ourselves that we weren't ever going to get down to our target assessment. But what I wanted to do is to say, right, let's make this risk belong to the customer. So I've got a simple tick box, and we will tick that one and save our risk. And we can now look at the risk register for just the risks that we need to worry about. And that is this one here. Okay, so the planning approval delayed risk doesn't appear in my list here. So now what we can do is to begin to build the pack we need to present to management as to what our approach is and our costs and the risks that we're going to be taking. And to do that, I'll start to run a report, and I'll be looking at this one here because it gives me a bit of a view. And running a report as a PDF is great if you're outputting something, but I want to add a few things to this one. So I'll actually output it as a PowerPoint. And what we get is, this is my base report that I've got here with those risks in it. Right. And again, we can see the scores and things and show this is what we're going to be able to do. And I could have added the actions in here as well if we wanted to, because remember, those actions need to be in our baseline.
So this is the sort of report that you'd be looking at with management in order to present what we're doing, and I can see on the left hand side, so the risk IDs, those are links into the risk, so you can just go in and out of the product.
That's right. Yeah, as it says there, control and click to follow the link. Yeah, okay. As simple as that in this case. That's right. So yeah, it's interactive. If you wanted to get more detail, you could click on that, and it would log you into the system and show you the details of that particular risk. That's right. Okay. So that's just come straight out of Predict Risk Controller. Now, if you remember back to our previous couple of webinars, we were looking at the overall budget, and our baseline estimate for the cost was at 62 million. But when we took the risks into account and got our 90% confidence, we were in at 65. million. Okay, so that was the cost that we need to be, that's the cost, okay, that we need to be looking at. So our baseline estimate plus our 90% risk confidence.
And then we would we would price it on top of that with margin.
That's right.
Okay, good.
We also, of course, have to deliver on time. Hopefully, if I click on the right button, there we go. This is our distribution of potential end dates for the project. The blue was just looking at the uncertainty that came out of the initial schedule, and it showed us here that the date that the schedulers gave us was the 10th of January, but taking the risk into account and uncertainty into account, we were only 50% likely to make that. Now, obviously, we need to give a date that we're far more confident of meeting as part of our bid. So we decided that 90% confidence was appropriate. Because if we went over that, then the date was going to be unacceptable to the client. Yeah, see, you've always got to play the commercial situation with your confidence, right? Yep. But at least you know it. Yeah. If we'd just gone ahead and said, "Oh, right, the schedule says it will finish on the 10th of January," unbeknownst to us, we'd only have a 50-50 chance of making it.
Yep. Right? Okay.
Now that last one that we were just looking at, if I just create a new slide here, then we can actually go back to our scenario sheet here. I can copy that graph and paste it in here. Of course, so that's sitting there, and then we can do things, that we wanted to here. So what was it? It was the planning risk removed.
Okay, so this again is the pack to put forward.
It's just
decision making
into that pack. That's right.
Okay,
that's right.
Good.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we're nearly there on the bid, and it feels like we've got some really good detail in here to go into negotiation. Okay, so we've just been looking at doing all of that in the Predict software. What about the benefits? Well, you want to have confidence in both your price and promise date based on the scope that you've got in your project, in your bid. And I think it's useful to think about 6 key ingredients. The first one, that you really do need to have this good risk-based information to make senior management decision level, take a view on things like your risk appetite, what do you want to take, what do you not want to take, things like opportunities. And in a really pressured situation when you're in a bid, that has to be fast decision making. So good information. You also need to make sure your actions, your risk treatment actions, are in the baseline, and that is that you're confident in your residual risk position. Things like that planning application risk, sometimes we call those tombstone risks. They're things that you just can't deal with, and it doesn't make sense for you to keep them in the bid. They're useful. It's a useful exercise to have a discussion with the customer about who's best to take that risk. Is it you or is it the customer? And you can do that on the basis of cost benefit. You should try to make sure that you understand your scope for change, what your options are, what your risk tolerance is, what opportunities you might be able to take. And then last but not least, there are 2 more things which are really around your customer. One of them is making sure you understand your customer's risk maturity, because in order to go into that discussion with customer, you need to understand how they're going to receive that. And also being able to have all this data behind you puts you in a great position to have those robust discussions. And of course, if you can prove over time on different bids that this works well, then that's going to put you in a great position to be in a winning position and to be competitive. And the results, the benefits, well, you hopefully, unlike Carillion, will be in profit. But there are softer sides of it as well. You really want, in this day and age, to be able to retain and recruit your staff. Having a productive workforce is more likely if you're actually on top of things and winning bids, but winning deliverable bids. And of course, you want a satisfied customer. Finally, leave you with the thought that it'd be really nice if, being on top of things, you could all go home on time. Right. So, as I said, we are Risk Decisions. We work with huge organisations worldwide. We've got some downloads. If you would like to, if you've got time for some further reading, there are a couple of risk intelligence white papers. Also, you might like to read the Femin case study. That's the tunnel between Denmark and Germany. I told you that we've been working on for many years. And there's also a brochure of our Predict software, if you're interested in having a look at that. So we've finally got the opportunity to come on to some questions. Right, going to the top. Right, so Brett asks, does that assume that mitigation completely removes the risk?
He's added a little bit extra to that in the...
Oh, sorry, okay, yeah.
Yeah, which is about the fact that we said, well, by mitigating the groundworks problem risk, we would be saving 1.15 million.
Yeah.
That's mitigating it to the target assessment. It's not completely removing the risk, it's just getting it to the target assessment. Interestingly, when I was looking at the current assessments, then the values I was getting there was what would happen if that risk was completely removed from the current assessment. What would my current assessment look like without that risk in there at all? Whereas the mitigation is taking it from the current value down to the target one.
Yeah, so the answer, Brett, is mitigation doesn't completely remove the risk. When Trevor brought up the screens where he was ticking the boxes to remove the risk, there were two columns. You could either choose to mitigate the risk or remove it altogether. And we did a bit of both. Next question is from Matt. On your first page of the report, you indicate the current risk rating and your target, but it doesn't show whether you have suitable mitigation to actually achieve the goal. Yes, that's because that report is a high-level single. It's just looking at risks. But there are two things you could do. Either you could use one of our more detailed reports that includes all of the actions, which is one of our standard reports. And they all come out in power. You can bring them, save them into PDF, PowerPoint, or Microsoft Word. And some people like the ability you can edit them. Some people don't. So it's your choice how what options you give. But also we have a custom report capability, which means if you wanted to have extra information on, for example, whether your mitigation actions were getting there, then you could add extra columns in and customize that. Did you have anything to add to that, Trevor?
No, I think that's just right. I think it was well spotted actually that that wasn't in there. And if I was perhaps producing this type of report, then I would perhaps include the actions as well, so we could really see that and highlight it.
Yeah. Or even just a summary it could even be a simple affirmative or non-affirmative as to where you've achieved, what you've achieved in terms of mitigation.
Yeah.
Okay, Natalia. So how do you know that the schedule has not taken into consideration some of these risks, especially with regards to timing? Okay. Have you got thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point actually. And it's almost down to your process and the culture within the organization as to when a scheduler is putting the schedule together, how are they coming up with their estimate for the duration of each activity? Are they looking at the worst case scenario, which effectively is including risks, and then if you then add those risks on as well, you're double counting. So you do really need to have it's not quite the audit trail, but the proof points when people are coming up with their assessments as to what they've based it upon. And that's as true for the estimates for the duration of activities as it is for the probability and potential impact of risks as well.
And I also think it's really important that whoever is doing the risk, providing the risk input into your bid, probably needs to have quite a high level of expertise. We quite often find that we have customers who are using Predict who might come to us and ask for some help when they're in a bid because they've come up with some results that they don't understand. It's usually not the software, it's the data input. And also you really need to make sure that any assumptions you've made is giving you really good sound results. And that includes things like the cost of time delays and the time-based element of any other risks that you've got in the system. But that's one of the things that Predict is quite good at. It's all joined up, so you can do your joined up cost time analysis and then bring it all back into Risk Controller. So, okay, right, we've got another question there. Do the what if changes made in Predict Risk Analyzer get automatically updated in the Risk Controller database? Oh, right. I think you touched a little bit on this, Trevor. Do you want to?
Yeah. No, basically, the simple answer is no, they don't. And one of the reasons for that is the whole point of the doing your risk analysis is to try things out, right? To see what effects different approaches are going to have, which are your best mitigation actions, which risks should you be trying to negotiate out of the contract, etc. So therefore, you don't want all of those changes automatically going back into the database because you're not really sure which ones you're going to go for, right? And also, you want to be able to, when you have decided what your approach is going to be, then you want to actually go into the risk, not only change, put in the up-to-date assessment, but actually put in your reasoning behind that, the assumptions you've made and why you've made those decisions. It's an audit trail in effect as to why you're doing things.
Yeah, and I think that is really important because if and when, in fact, when you win the bid,
yes,
then you want to make sure that you do have that audit trail of the decisions you made. I know so many organisations who sadly do bids in, on the back of an envelope, do the risk calculations. I mean, probably not just adding 10, 15% on the top anymore, I hope, but they don't have enough robust transfer from the bid stage into the actual through negotiation and onto contract. And really, you ought to have that as a sound backdrop to the decisions you made. Right, how do I convince my bid manager that we need to do this? Oh, okay. Well,
this is one of your favourite ones, Val. Go on.
Yes, I know. Well, why wouldn't you do it? I guess I'd have to ask. I do understand that the risk element of it can be quite, it can be fairly significant, but typically, I've worked on lots of bids with customers over the years, and typically the first set of data you come out shows that you've got almost no chance of delivering to the budget or the timescales that your management or the customer have asked for. That doesn't mean to say it's not possible. Usually it is possible. And if you take, for example, working on the 2012 Olympic Village, there was an impossible task to deliver against the backdrop of the credit crunch and everything else that was happening at that time. But it was a matter of innovating and working out and problem solving. So you can do it, but you've got to have, you need enough time. And that's the biggest thing you need to convince your bid manager of, is that you start early. Risk management is not an add-on. Because if it's an add-on, you only get to learn the bad news just before you're about to submit the bid. And the other thing that we touched on in the presentation is you've got to make sure that your actions are costed into the baseline. Otherwise, your risk budget is not going to cover that residual risk that you've promised yourself you can, and promise your management you can deliver, because you aren't going to get there. Managing risk doesn't come 100% for free. The residual position does mean you've got to do some of those actions. And the earlier you get those actions into the baseline and get on with them, the lower cost that will turn out to be. So yeah, it's getting there early is what I would say.